So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our event on feminist futures, education research on gender, climate change, and corruption. This is a part of the 66th Commission on the Status of Women that is hosted by UN Women. My name is Maggie McCurdy. I am a graduate student in the Peace Engineering program at Drexel University. I'll be moderating the event. For some reason it's not going forward. Sorry for that. Oh, there we go. So we have a great panel for you today. First, we have Riza, Aryani, Leah, Cairone, and Cait O'Donnell presenting on Duhung, the gendered impacts of deforestation in Indonesia. Next, we have Rebecca Clothey, who is a PhD in the Global Studies and Modern Languages Department at Drexel University, presenting on the role of Uyghur women in cultural preservation. Next, we'll have Kristy Kelly, who is a faculty professor in the School of Education at Drexel University, presenting on Chasing Shadows, Gender, Crises, and Corruption in Vietnam, followed by Kejsi Ruka, who is an undergraduate student in the Global Studies Department at Drexel University as well. And she'll be presenting on Corruption is Not an Equal Opportunity Institution, a gendered analysis of anti-corruption training. And finally, we'll have Kathlyn Elliott, who is a PhD candidate in the School of Education, also at Drexel University, presenting on preventing violent extremism in Finland. What do teachers have to do with it? So now I'll pass it off to Riza and Leah. I'll stop sharing my screen so you can share yours and take it away.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we don't prepare a slide, but we're just gonna share our story on the documentary that we made about 5 years ago, so it's been a while, on the gendered impact of deforestation, looking at a case study in Indonesia. Hi everyone, it's so lovely to see you all. Hi from Indonesia. My name is Riza Aryani. I used to be a student at Sappa with Professor Kristy Kelly, where we did this documentary. I'm currently a senior research manager at this impact company called SecondMuse, where I support our impact and learning team to identify activities that work and doesn't, sort of integrating our learning into the way we do things, from supporting strategies to address ocean plastic in South and Southeast Asia, to addressing issues related to gender equality in tech in North America. So that's a bit of introduction about me. I'm going to pass it on to Leah before we start sharing a little bit about the documentary. Leah.
Thank you so much, Riza. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. My name is Leah Cairone. I'm really excited to be here with you today. My current role, it's relatively new, but I am the Director of Sustainability and Resiliency at the New York City Budget Office. And in that role, I help to oversee the budget in New York City across everything we do to make our city more sustainable, and also to protect our communities against climate threats like extreme weather, including flooding and heat. I formerly worked in the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability, where I oversaw climate action planning, and also worked to pass a local law that requires big buildings in New York to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions over time. I am very passionate about policy development that is equitable and inclusive, and so excited to have this conversation. And like Riza mentioned, when I was pursuing my master's degree at Columbia University, I had the opportunity to work with Riza and our colleague Cait to travel to Indonesia and produce the short documentary about the gendered impacts of deforestation. And so to be able to learn about and elevate some of those issues facing the community that we worked with was really meaningful for me, and looking forward to the conversation. I'll pass it back to you, Riza, to talk a little bit about the work that we did.
Thanks, Leah. Unfortunately, Cait can't join us today, but yeah, we'll share on her behalf as well. So a little bit about the documentary. It's available on YouTube, so it's 20-minute long, and we had a blast working on it, traveling to Indonesia, talking to so many people about this issue. It started off as a curiosity. It was me, Leah, and Cait as a student at SEPA, learning public policy, but also wanting to understand what does the overlap between gender and environment look like? Where do we even begin to understand this issue? And at that time, we sort of tried to figure out what would be the entry point. So we started talking to experts, people who have been working in this space. At that time, we started with talking to some people from Conservation International, people from the Center for International Forestry Research. And from then on, we were lucky to get some resource and support from the school to conduct this field trip going to Indonesia. And we also got really lucky to have a community who would be so open to share their story with us and let us stay with them and be sort of observe their daily routine and have conversation to learn more about their experiences. So this documentary, the short documentary, is basically our attempt to share the reality from a case study in Indonesia of what an overlap between gender and environment looks like in Indonesia, in this small community in Borneo, in East Kalimantan. What we found at that, I think the process, the findings, the process was almost as valuable as the findings that we got. The process of talking to people, trying to gain trust of the community, and also figuring out what angle that we're going to take this story. One of the most valuable thing, I think, when we tried to form this narrative was learning about avoiding the trap of a single, the danger of a single story, which is we definitely don't want to portray the community using only their problems. So we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how we can present this community as this whole, not just defined by their problem. And one of the main things that we found there, we ended up talking about or discovering how the impact of the environmental changes is actually gendered. Men and women experience it differently. However, most of the time, one part of that reality is missing simply because of the way we collect data, the way we try to understand that reality. And so, yeah, that documentary is our attempt to highlight that reality that hopefully will be useful, not only for environmental researchers, but beyond that, in every challenges that we face right now. I think that is still very relevant. I personally carry that lesson with me in my professional journey, working for the Wildlife Conservation Society on deforestation and rural livelihoods, how it is challenging to try to paint the full picture, to understand the nuances, but it's highly necessary. That sometimes like conventional strategy for data collection might not work. Most of the time I get data about the experiences of women by cooking breakfast with them in the kitchen, or actually hang out with them as they wait for their kids coming back from school. And those small interactions is actually a way for us professionals to try to understand the challenges fully in the community that we try to support. Leah, I'm going to pass it on to you. And if you could share some of your experiences or takeaways from the process and learnings that we got through making that documentary.
Thank you, Riza. And it's great to hear your experience and how you've been able to take forward some of the learnings. And I think what I took from this experience was very similar in some ways. So I just wanted to share really two lessons that and learnings that I took from this experience that were really powerful for me and that I continue to use in this day. And it is similar to what Riza shared. First is that it's so important to listen and to hear everyone's story and experience. And so, like Riza alluded to, part of that is being able to capture quantitative data. So in the film, we do talk quite a bit about the importance of collecting and using sex disaggregated data, and the same would be true for, capturing all sorts of different perspectives from whatever community that you're working with. But also, like you say, Riza, it's also about qualitative data and really hearing from people and about their own experiences directly, and making sure that we do that in an inclusive way that allows us to center equity in the work that we do. And that's important because we have to, in order to do good work with a community, we have to understand, like you say, Riza, not just the challenges, but the history, fears, needs, desires, priorities, everything, to be able to really be supportive. And like you say, it was really the process that was so interesting about this experience, because we didn't know what the issues were going into this, right? We went and we spoke with people and we listened and we learned. And I've really taken that forward in my work now. I mentioned really briefly that I, in the past years, have worked to develop a local law in New York City to limit carbon pollution in big buildings. And that has been incredibly complicated and rewarding, but one of the most important elements has been, or the most important pieces of that has been, to bring together a broad and inclusive coalition of community leaders and stakeholders to really grapple with a number of issues, but I would say the main being these dual challenge of achieving our sustainability goals and also preserving affordability, and ensuring that people across New York have equal access to benefits and aren't burdened by anything that we decide is important to put forward. So that was really important to me, that lesson about engaging with everyone and really taking to heart the experiences that we learn about. And then relatedly, the second learning that I had was about how important it is to build relationships and trust, and that's something that takes time. I think we did the best that we could with the time that we had, but if I had to do it again, I think we both would agree that we'd like to spend more time being able to build trust and being able to come back and have a reciprocal relationship, right? Because it was difficult to be able to build a strong relationship. And you're right, Riza, we were really lucky to be working with people who were so warm and welcoming and supported what we were doing, but it was a challenge. And so again, in the work that I do now, I always try to keep that in mind and make sure that, we're not engaging with the community one time, but we create channels where we can work together over time and be able to build that trust and be able to support one another even more. So thank you for the opportunity to share today. Really looking forward to the conversation and any questions that arise. Riza, I think unless you have something else to share, I think we're supposed to pass the mic.
Yeah, I think next one, we're passing it on to Rebecca.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Rebecca Clothey, and I am a faculty member in the Department of Global Studies and Modern Languages, and also the School of Education at Drexel. I have a joint appointment. And I'm going to be talking today about Uyghur cultural preservation. I do research on the Uyghur ethnic group, which is an ethnic group indigenous to Northwest China. And I'm going to talk a little first about some of the issues that they're encountering in their home region, and why women are important in promoting the cultural preservation. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, all right. So I want to give you some background first. And first of all, women play a critical role in maintaining cultural identity in their communities. And one of the reasons is that they usually play a central role in most societies in caring for and educating children. And because they're producers and reproducers of family life, they play an important role in transmitting cultural values and traditions to future generations. And they do this informally and also formally, which is something I'm going to talk about today. We're going to be talking about a community, as I mentioned, that are indigenous to Northwest China. Many of you may have heard about them. China is culturally diverse. There are 55 officially recognized ethnic groups of China, and they come from the Uyghurs themselves are one of those 55. They are indigenous to this region, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which is in Northwest China. And I include two maps here because this one shows the provincial composition of China, and this one shows all the border regions, all the regions that border Xinjiang itself. And one reason why I think that's important to understand is because Xinjiang is culturally diverse. We find many of these populations from the surrounding region also living in Xinjiang. Uyghurs themselves have their own language called Uyghur, and it uses an Arabic script. So this is a sign that shows the Uyghur script from the capital city, Urumqi, capital city of Xinjiang. And you see here, this is Chinese. So it's a bilingual area. And many Uyghurs are also Muslim. They're also practicing Muslim, some. So I took this picture here on the lower right-hand side in 2015. And I want to comment briefly about the way this woman is dressed. That is not an indigenous or traditional way of dressing in the Uyghur community. However, in recent decades, some Uyghurs have embraced a more conservative form of Islam. In fact, Uyghurs historically are Sunni, quite moderate Muslims, but they became more conservative. Some became more conservative in recent decades, and some women began embracing a more conservative type of Islamic dress. This is important to the story because although China is officially atheist because it is a one-party system run by the Communist Party of China, religion is permitted within some parameters, or at least it's permitted by the Constitution. Everyone has the right to believe or not believe in a religion. That's actually enshrined within the Constitution, but there were some parameters. So any religious leaders, imams, monks, priests, ministers, etc., had to be officially approved by the government before they were able to practice their religion. And any religious organization, by which I mean a temple, a mosque, a church, had to be registered with one of the patriotic religious associations, and they had to demonstrate that they supported the Communist Party. So things started to change in the Uyghur region. Actually, there have historically been some ethnic challenges between Uyghurs and the majority group of China, the Han Chinese. There have been historical tensions. And in 2009, these erupted into ethnic conflict. There was a large protest that was held by Uyghurs in the area. They were protesting against some policies that they thought were not fair for them, and it erupted into violence, quite terrible violence between the ethnic groups. There were fires lit, cars were lit on fire, buses were overturned, and many people ended up dead. And the police got quite nervous about this, or the Chinese government got quite nervous about this. It was clear that there were ethnic tensions. And one of the things that the government thought was to blame for this was the increase in fundamentalist Islamic beliefs, which they also attributed to coming from outside sources, outside of China. Some people had gone on the Hajj and had come back being more conservative. This was the narrative, and the government was worried about terrorist acts. So they started introducing policies to discourage women, for example, from dressing in a conservative Islamic way. In 2011, it started out as encouraging, and it later became more restrictive. So in 2011, they implemented a policy called Project Beauty, where they encouraged women to, quote, show your pretty faces and let your beautiful hair fly in the wind. There was a whole campaign about it to get women not to cover. And unlike in France, it wasn't illegal yet, but you were not permitted to wear headscarves if you wanted to go into government spaces like banks, schools, buses, etc. But in your private life, you at that time could still wear such clothes. It just was not encouraged. These are a series of pictures that were posted on social media around the same time. They were trying to encourage women to wear shorter skirts, not long skirts. And so they actually started cutting them off. You can see from this picture. And unfortunately, there continued to be some terrorist events, not only in the Uyghur region, but actually across China. There were several. And they were blamed on Uyghur Islamic terrorist groups. So of course, the government continued to be nervous about the influence of fundamentalist Islam, and they started increasing the amount of security spending in the region. And you can see, compared from 2015 to 2017, there was a huge jump in security spending. One of the things they spent it on was an increase in the police. Another thing they spent it on was surveillance cameras throughout the region. And these cameras had facial recognition software. This is an artistic representation of Uyghur dancers wearing some traditional clothing. And this shows how the facial recognition software can identify who they are just from the face. Starting from 2015, it actually became illegal to dress in any of these ways. So this is a poster that started going up around the Uyghur region that shows 5 things that are not allowed. You can see different types of covering the head, covering the face, this kind of dress. Also, they did not want men to have long beards because they thought that also indicated radical Islam. And also the star and crescent was also abolished. One thing that has been in the news quite a bit is re-education training centers. They started sending people to re-education training centers to de-radicalize. So if you showed a tendency, or you were thought to show a tendency towards radical Islam, they would put you in a training center to re-educate you, to de-radicalize you. And even though this picture is all men, there were also facilities for women. One of the things of note is that China, as you probably know, had a one-child policy for a very long time. Only recently, they changed it to a two-child policy. And some of the measures to maintain the one-child policy were quite drastic. After going towards the two-child policy, sterilizations across China went down. But in the Uyghur region in Xinjiang, they actually have gone up quite a lot. Some of the women who have been released from the re-education camps have claimed that they were sterilized without their permission. The use of IUDs has also gone up in Xinjiang, even though it's gone down across China, and the birth rate in Xinjiang has decreased drastically compared to the growth in recent years. So this is one of the ways that this so-called counterterrorism policy is directly impacting women, and as cultural carriers, without the continuation of the Uyghur population, you won't find the continuation of the culture either, obviously. So for those who aren't in the camps, many of the men have been incarcerated, and so women are at home alone. Now there's a policy for so-called brothers and sisters where government officials come and will visit Uyghur homes. They'll get to know the family, and their task is to try to make sure that they are following party policies. They'll look for things, evidence in the house like Qurans or religious paintings or things like that on the wall. They'll ask the children, does your mommy pray with you at night? That kind of thing. And they take notes and report back. At first, we were hearing that they were staying for a couple of days at a time. Now we're hearing more often about officials moving into the house and staying there, oftentimes a male moving in when the female is alone because her husband might be experiencing re-education. So if the government official is in the house and does not speak Uyghur, then that means that Uyghur also is not being spoken in the home. There has also been an incentivization program to encourage Uyghur women to marry Han Chinese men, not the other way around. Women are exoticized, they're considered quite beautiful, and there are government campaigns now about how Uyghur women are looking for Han Chinese men to marry. They do pay the couple, the government pays the couple if they're an inter-ethnic marriage between Uyghur and Han. And there have also been some stories that women are coerced into doing it with promises that their brother might be released from prison or their father might be released from the camps. One thing to take note of in these pictures is that you don't see any specific Uyghur cultural wedding traditions at all. Oftentimes, if it's an inter-ethnic marriage, as we find everywhere in the world, the common language between the couple is the one that gets spoken with the children. So this is one way that the Uyghur language would be lost over time because they wouldn't be speaking it at home. There are also many artists, musicians, and other cultural carriers who have been incarcerated. So there are restrictions now on the Uyghur culture. So as I mentioned, Uyghur women are the core for passing down language, arts, traditional dishes, and other closely connected parts of the culture and its history. This is a picture of Uyghur food. And I want to talk now a little bit about some things that women specifically can do in diaspora, because it's much more challenging now to carry on the culture in the current political environment within China, but there are diaspora communities and it really is up to them. So there's a reason why the language that you speak when you're growing up is called your mother tongue. And that is because usually it's the language that your mother speaks to you, because usually traditionally women have been the ones who invested the most in childcare. So the first thing is, if you speak the language at home, the children should grow up speaking the language. One of the issues right now in diaspora is that, and this is true of every community, not only Uyghurs, families are nervous about their children learning the host country's language, and so they're not necessarily speaking Uyghur at home. Uyghur language teachers have told me that the greatest threat to Uyghur language is the parents. And what they mean by that is the parents aren't speaking Uyghur and therefore the children are not either. Unfortunately, another issue is that children don't necessarily see the value of speaking Uyghur because there's no economic value to it. If you're living in the US, you need to speak English. If you're living in Turkey, you need to speak Turkish. Those are the languages that are going to find you jobs and help you to function in society. And so not all children are even interested in learning the language. But communities can find ways to support children in their language efforts and in their cultural efforts. So this is a picture of a community-run language school in diaspora. This one is in Turkey, where they're teaching Uyghur, among other things. And actually, there are a number of Uyghur language schools throughout the diaspora in Australia, in Washington, D.C., in Istanbul, in Norway, anywhere where there's a largish Uyghur community. Oftentimes, they are run, organized, and taught by Uyghur women. These are usually volunteer positions. They're not making money. And sometimes women are the ones who don't have the jobs in diaspora, and so they have time to devote to this important task. These schools can also serve as community centers. Earlier, the speakers were talking about the importance of the community and getting to know the community. Children who aren't interested in learning a language, maybe they think all of their friends speak English, so why should they learn Uyghur? Well, if they know other Uyghur children who are speaking Uyghur, then it will emphasize the value to them. This is a picture of a performance on a UN Mother Tongue Day. There's a Mother Language Day once a year, organized by the UN, actually, and This diaspora community had children learn a song and perform it. They also performed Uyghur poetry. You can see that they're wearing Uyghur clothing as well. So these schools serve a function of teaching language, but also Uyghur music and other Uyghur traditions. So this is the song. I'll skip through that in the interest of time. So the last thing that I want to talk about is the importance of language media. If the language is used for media such as the internet, television, and social media, then it will also preserve the value. This is a Uyghur TV channel that you can find on YouTube, and it also has its own website. And if you click through it, you can find dances, songs, music, all kinds of cultural activities that will continue to preserve the culture and hopefully ongoing. In any case, culture is a living thing. It's not stagnant. And the people who are part of that culture are the ones who have the responsibility for maintaining it. And so women can play an important role. And that's all, I guess, that I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was so interesting and really connects interestingly to me to the first presentation on the minoritized community in Indonesia as well. And my name is Kristy Kelly. I will be presenting next on my own research in Vietnam, so a little bit in between those two countries in Southeast Asia, but also regarding my work with a particular ethnic minority community there. Let me share my screen, called the Hmong. And I have been living and working in and around Vietnam for about 25 years. And so today I want to talk a little bit about one minority community in the uplands of Vietnam and how they manage development. The title of my talk is Chasing Shadows, Gender Crises and Corruption in Vietnam. While there are many forms of corruption, to many women, petty corruption or the everyday abuse of entrusted power by low and mid-level public officials and community leaders is the most common form of corruption. Petty corruption is most visible as they try to access basic goods or services in places like hospitals, schools, police departments, land management agencies, and when they apply for jobs. This is particularly true for ethnic minority women living along the Vietnam-China border who are increasingly required to negotiate with development bureaucrats vying for control over their livelihoods and trade and tourism. Managing petty corruption has become something of a shadow economy in many communities around the world. It's rarely captured in formal measures of corruption or even in anti-corruption campaigns. When it is, data suggests that men are more likely to be asked to pay bribes, while women are more likely to fall victim to sexual extortion. While international development communities are beginning to pay more attention to this, there's very little scholarly literature related to the connections between gender equality and climate change, development, corruption, and education. Today, I'd like to take a stab at trying to make those connections and lay out a framework for why those of us working on gender equality should actually be paying more attention to corruption and its connection to inequality. So let me introduce you to my good friend and research collaborator, Mao. Mao is from an upland area of Vietnam called Sappa. She's from the ethnic minority group called the Hmong. There are 52 ethnic groups in Vietnam, and while the majority group are called Kinh or Viet, she is one of the minority. Most of her community live what we would call traditional lives and what she calls a traditional life. She lives along the Lao-China border, and her life is devoted to protecting herself and other women from being trafficked. She married early to prevent being trafficked as part of a bride capture tradition, and she's now involved in a variety of elaborate schemes to protect herself and her family from losing their land, keeping their children in school, getting access to and passing certification exams to keep their jobs, accessing healthcare, and maintaining their livelihoods in the context of COVID and increasing climate change and disasters. Sometimes these schemes work to maximize their profits and can be seen as greasing the wheels of business to speed up the work of complicated bureaucracies, or to hold petty bureaucrats accountable to just do their jobs. Outside of such contexts, these fees might be what we would call expediting fees, when the cost is transparent and anyone with money can pay them. The goal is to get advanced to the head of the line. But when they're not transparent, when costs are negotiated or people don't have the resources to pay, when refusing to pay means you're denied services, then we can call this petty corruption. Mao regularly pays such fees to assure low-level bureaucrats do their job and treat her fairly. Figuring out what fees to pay, when to pay them, how to pay them, to whom they should be paid is the work of many women, and it's nearly a full-time job. This is what she calls chasing shadows. And so I want to talk through some of the work that she does along the way. But first, how important is corruption to life in Asia? So there's some growing indicators that suggest that bribery rates are actually on the increase through most of the Asia Pacific region. Vietnam has among the highest bribery rates for public schools and healthcare, which interestingly are areas that most women work and most women are engaged in managing school and healthcare for families. People under age 35 are more likely to have to pay a bribe to access public services. Women are as likely as men to pay bribes, and poor people are more likely to pay bribes generally, except in Vietnam, where the richest are more likely to pay compared to the poorest. So why is this? We're going to take a look at Mao's life to see how she's managed this and why this is shaping the way she interacts with the community around her. So as I mentioned, Mao lives in the area of Lao Cai up along the China-Vietnam border. You can see these pictures from the actual border. The bridge there is the border across to China where most trade takes place. It's very active and it is a formal trade route, but the borders are quite porous. And so those with fewer resources rely on informal trade routes to avoid paying high fees or delays en route, both of which can be negotiated through bribes. While Mao's family is not involved in trade per se, living near a border presents opportunities and risks for those not involved in trade as well. The area that Mao lives in is called Sappa and has become a key tourist destination for in-country travel and for international tourists. The area on this map shows Mao's where she lives. She lives sort of on the center on the right-hand side of the map, down inside the valley. This area is restricted to development and allows for Mao's community to maintain cultural tradition, including farming, handicrafts, traditional housing, traditional food, and has become a booming tourist industry until COVID shut it down in January 2020. It has yet to reopen. So when Mao was a young girl, while she was attending school, European, Western, Australian, North American backpackers would start to kind of wander through the villages, really interested in learning about local culture and traditions. So oftentimes the children from school would run outside and follow along with them and try to learn English or German or French along the way. And so they became informal trekking guides. Over time, the trekking industry was formalized and it became a trade. Most women actually, it's only women that work in this industry for the most part. The trade of tourism has grown so that now there are homestays, there are guided tours, there are fabulous traditional baths. You can learn how to embroider, you can learn how to cook and sew, you can learn how to make many of the handicrafts in the area. This is a part of women's storytelling about how they are maintaining their tradition and how they're able to stay in their community and not migrate to other areas to make more money. What's interesting is that women also, because they haven't really gone to school for very much of their lives, have learned languages by speaking to the tourists. Very few of them are fluent in the national language of Vietnamese, but many of them speak French, German, Japanese, Korean, Dutch, and Chinese, as well as English. Their success And increasing global interest in the region has not gone unnoticed by the central government or national tourist industry. In the early 1990s and into the early 2000s, when I first started research in the region, it took an overnight train and a 5-hour-long winding commute on the back of a motorbike and a half-day trek through rice paddies to reach Mao's village. Today, tourists can be picked straight from the airport and arrive there 4 to 5 hours later on a fancy vehicle. Ecotourism more recently has increased by putting in 5-star resorts, spas, cable cars, allowing wealthy tourists to skip the trekking and cultural exchanges and just get to the top of the highest mountain or most beautiful waterfall. The tourism industry has clearly bifurcated, with the ecotourism options with guides like Mao catering to mainly European, American, and Australian tourists and young people from Asia. The 5-star resort industry caters to wealthier Asians who are older and less experienced travelers, but join tours and are guided by Vietnamese guides from the capital, Hanoi. New rules and practices further bifurcate the tourism industry, creating hard lines between them. The central government controls all access through king managers who migrate from peri-urban centers where their chances for kids to go to school or have a good life were not very high to begin with. Here, they can quickly make money. Their kids are perceived as hardworking, bright, privileged, and talented compared to the now minoritized ethnic minority children. And so the Mao's community is losing some power here. These rules and practices are being defined by the first in, and they tend to leave out women like Mao. She's left in a very precarious position. Afraid of falling between the cracks, early marriage and dropping out of school to become trekkers are the best options against risking being trafficked. For Hmong families who remain in Sappa, development, pollution, congestion is part of daily life. New construction helps provide jobs, but at barely subsistent wages. The roads are potholed due to overloaded trucks going to construction sites every day, and there are now 5,000 to 8,000 cars arriving, creating even more congestion and pollution. Mao's husband used to work in a restaurant here in the city, but he's no longer able to make the daily commute home due to traffic congestion, so he quit his job to be home with his family. Mao increased her trekking days, and her husband now cooks lunch at home for guests. Prior to COVID, they started building a traditional wooden home and hope to have a homestay together. But COVID closed the tourism industry. Today, Mao is trying to make whatever money she can by embroidery. She's gone back to her traditional craft and is trying to sell things internationally. But as she says, not writing English well enough, not having access to the internet very clearly, she's losing a sense of how to make money. So she misses her trekking guide. The family has also tried to expand their farming. They are drying corn, they're selling watermelons, but getting things to the market through muddy roads due to flooding and climate change issues has again left her in a precarious position. The picture on the top right is her family's advertisement that they're actually going to start selling some of their land, and guess who's coming in to buy it? Those who have money from the urban areas, and so land grabbing is now becoming a problem. Mao is trying to protect her future by investing in her son. But even here, she cannot escape the effects of market-driven development and fuzzy rules and regulations. She has moved her son to live in with her parents so they can be in a better school district. He attends special summer and after-school programs to receive the tutoring he needs to compete with his Vietnamese peers. She's preparing for the extra cost of sending him to a boarding school for high school, since at this point, there are no high schools within easy travel of his home. She and her husband have stopped speaking Hmong at home and only speak Vietnamese to make sure that he has the best chance of getting ahead. Education policy designed to privilege ethnic minority students assures him a seat if he does well in both high school and college. But she's heard that this policy is not always implemented as designed. Envelopes paid years in advance can guarantee her son will not be left behind and a job when he graduates. Many in her community, though, ask why bother finishing school when the cost of obtaining a job is nearly a year's salary paid to the employer in advance. As noted earlier, migration from the King majority into this area is increasing competition for scarce resources, and it's bifurcating the education system now as well as the tourism industry. Against this backdrop, the Vietnamese government has taken really important steps to address governance and corruption challenges. There's a new anti-corruption law which criminalizes all types of corruption. There are institutions, there's an Office of Central Steering Committee for Anti-Corruption, a People's Procuracy, a state audit, new government offices throughout every district and province across the country. This street sign is part of a national campaign to educate and teach about anti-corruption work and to raise public awareness. But if we peruse actual corruption cases making the headlines in the news, it tends to leave some stories out. Well, they look pretty gendered, huh? From top, we see corruption in education, embezzlement, Petro-Vietnam, the national oil industry, all really high-ranking cases of corruption. Spaces and places and processes where corruption take place at the community level, where women like Mao are actually navigating and negotiating to avoid corruption, are pretty much left out of the news. These images are pictures from Mao's community of children who have been retrieved from being trafficked across the border, and women who were trafficked coming to educate at the local marketplace to prevent that same experience for their peers. While what I've presented today is just one case, it's Mao's story. It's important in helping us see how corruption has been institutionalized into development practices, particularly in communities where access to national politics and decision-making is really hard. We see that when informal networks, which can appear local and serve as more or less temporary solutions to problems of exchange, are left unresolved or unsolved by lack of rule of law and administrative reform, they risk becoming corruption. When they're left to evolve naturally, these informal networks also risk becoming elaborate systems of neo-patrimonial exchange, and those are hard to change. In Mao's case, her need to pay small envelopes here and there to grease the wheels and ensure she maintains her livelihood is situated within racialized and gendered neo-patrimonial regimes of power, amplified by global capital and development. As an institution, corruption is gendered, one that is shaped by patriarchy and global capital. Women are not absent, nor are they merely victims or political cleaners who can fix the problem, such as the discourse would like to tell us. By taking a step back, considering how corruption itself produces discourses and practices and meanings about gender and about women, and change over time and place, as well as to the user, we can make visible why what appears as corruption to some can appear acceptable to others. Centering marginalized communities and women's experiences within them is key to this process. Just as Mao has been able to weave together a livelihood that's more than just farming, weaving, handicrafts, trekking, mothering, and advocacy in her community, so we need to examine the links between gender equality, climate change, corruption, and education. I want to thank you for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions or to hear about your own work as we get to the Q&A session today. I'm now going to turn it over to Kejsi Ruka, who's been building off some of this work on gender and corruption to examine opportunities for development practitioners to learn more about the linkages between gender equality and corruption and how we might address some of the gaps. Kejsi, I turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Kelly, for that great background on gender and corruption. I will be taking it a step further, as you mentioned. And so, hello, I'm Kejsi. I'm an undergraduate global studies major at Drexel. Let me just, okay. And so I'll be talking about how corruption is not an equal opportunity institution, a gendered analysis of anti-corruption training. Before getting into my research, I want to give a little bit of background on why I decided to focus on training. So I first started my research with a deep dive on the scholarly literature in the field. And by mapping the gender and corruption field, you can see how, depending on the starting point, you may follow a different path into gender and corruption. And really, there are two seminal articles in the field that shape the discourse around the topic. So one study, which is on the left, is titled, "Are Women Really the Fairest Sex? Corruption in Women in Government?" And so this study was conducted by the World Bank and is considered to be one of the breakthrough pieces for the field and conducted by David Dollar in 2001. And the study really sets up a binary of gender and specifically of women as the fairer sex, or somehow being inherently good actors in comparison to men. And when starting with this article, it leads to political science articles, other practitioner studies, and pieces that focus on more or less essentializing characteristics of women. On the other hand is a piece by sociologist and academic Anne-Marie Getz, almost in a response to Dollar, which moves away from women's characteristics to gender as a social construct. And if we do a network analysis through Getz, we see it leads to more sociology and feminist research. And so looking at these two articles, it seems like the two analyses are speaking in different spaces, or in other words, there seems to be very little connection between these different perspectives. And this basically leaves a huge gap of the literature that does not view corruption beyond the dynamic of women as victims or women as political cleaners for acting against corruption. And so there is a growing amount of literature on gender and corruption, or in the practitioner space specifically, which was really kickstarted or revived, I guess, by this UNDP study that had around 76% of women, grassroots women in 11 communities across 8 countries, that identified corruption as their greatest barrier to accessing public goods and services. So organizations like Human Rights Watch, the UN, USAID, etc., are making the connections between gender and corruption, but they're not engaging in the scholarly literature that moves beyond basic understandings of gender. And so this had me a little, seeing the mapping of this knowledge in the literature space made me curious about other spaces through which people can learn about gender and corruption, specifically for practitioners. And so this led me to trainings as a tool for anti-corruption education, and even the CSW as spaces where practitioners gather and come to learn and exchange information about gender and corruption. And for this reason, my research questions are: how is gender represented in anti-corruption training? How is corruption represented in gender training? How are gender and corruption represented in the UN CSW space? And what gaps and opportunities remain? So where can we learn about gender and corruption? Well, in my investigation, I looked into both anti-corruption training separately and gender equality training separately. And so this came to a total of 25 trainings. And just to give you a little bit of background, on the anti-corruption side, I identified 9 trainings that came from a variety of different sources, but just to give you a general overview, included Transparency International, U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center, Coursera, and the Basel Institute. 6 of these courses were open access to the public, and 3 of them had a fee in order to access the material. On the other hand, gender equality training. So I identified 15 of these trainings that came from sources like the World Bank, UN Women, UNICEF, and Trailend. And 13 of these were open access and 2 with the fee. And among these trainings, which is interesting, is that I only found 1 course which was focused on both gender and corruption, and this was not even open access to the public. So it really speaks to how relatively new this field is. So to show you an example of 2 of the courses I've taken and I've been taking a closer look at, one which focuses on corruption is called What is Corruption? Anti-Corruption and Compliance, and it's hosted by Coursera. On the other hand, there's I Know Gender 1, 2, 3, which is a gender equality course hosted by the UN Women Training Center. And so the main takeaway for both of these are for both anti-corruption trainings and gender equality training in general, is that they, on the anti-corruption side, they don't include a lot of content on gendered forms of corruption. Whereas on the gender equality side, they don't include a lot of information on how corruption affects women. And so for the purposes of this presentation, I will focus specifically on anti-corruption trainings, mainly because of the strategic impact and that it would be easier to sort of mainstream gender into this corruption work that already exists. And so training and education are actually really useful tools in fighting corruption. They are effective as a preventative measure of corruption by encouraging a culture of anti-corruption and enforcing a commitment on transparency and accountability for those who are participating in the trainings. They can also serve a wide range of audiences and are easy to implement, as most companies or NGOs, universities, et cetera, have some form of ethics or compliance trainings already. And finally, trainings are important spaces where knowledge is disseminated, contested, and discussed by participants. So a very important political space in which knowledge is created. And so the purpose of anti-corruption education can be understood through the following, and I'll just read these out loud. Anti-corruption training and education must aim at promoting a deeper understanding of the intricacies of corruption, as well as an analysis of how corruption unfolds across countries, regions, and institutions. Anti-corruption training should provide an analytical framework and hands-on skills on how to address corruption in practice. So taking all of this into consideration, let's take a closer look into this anti-corruption training and what is it teaching us, what is it missing? So here I have like a sort of an overview of the biggest gaps that I found in analyzing the anti-corruption course I mentioned, and just in general, the trend throughout these courses. Many of the online courses I've taken tend to be very corporate centric, meaning they focus heavily on corruption in the business world and how to implement compliance policies to create a culture of anti-corruption within that entity alone. And so this leads into the second gap, which is because the courses focus so heavily on the corporate world and bribery of government officials, there's this understanding that corruption is almost isolated between these two institutions. However, as you know, the scholarly literature indicates, corruption can spread from one institution to the other. For example, if a company or corporation decides to fund efforts in education or in the healthcare sector. So it's really important to recognize how corruption can be a structural problem across society. And then there are the more gendered elements. So for example, there is little to no mention of women or gender-based corruption in these anti-corruption courses, whether that means how women are affected by corruption in accessing resources, how women navigate corrupt institutions, or how women themselves can be corrupt. And on the other hand, there are little to no gender-sensitive mechanisms. And one good example of how to integrate this would be creating mechanisms for reporting corruption that consider the gender dynamics of a space. And so this would make not only women feel safe, but also send a message to male colleagues about accountability. And overall, this framework leads participants to think that corruption is either gender neutral or gender blind or simply a men's issue. And it's counter to both what the scholarly literature is saying and even the practitioner literature is saying, because women aren't even mentioned as part of the problem or solution. And it leaves this big gap and misunderstanding of corruption as a field. And so based on the academic literature and growing attention to this issue within the UN, USAID, et cetera, all these different spaces, here are my recommendations for designing anti-corruption training, some of the biggest questions to consider. What does corruption look like for the intended target group? How are men affected differently than women by this form of corruption? And so I included this question because, you know, most trainings don't look into the gendered forms of corruption, and corruption looks different depending on the specific group we're talking about. For women, it can involve things like sextortion or, you know, exchanging bodies instead of money as currency. Also, who are the best candidates for designing and conducting the anti-corruption training? For example, many of the trainings have male professors giving the content or saying the information. So how can we include women in this dialogue, or how can we include women in the creation of this dialogue? Next, have gender experts, whether in NGOs, women's groups, or academia, being consulted in the creation of the training. So this is really important for, as I said, like engaging in the existing literature, whether that be practitioner literature, academic, so that these conversations can be connected. What is the intended impact of the anti-corruption training? Have any implications been considered? And so this is really important for just in general, considering how women may be impacted by the training, either in a positive way or in a negative way. And finally, is there a balance between the analytical framework and the practical hands-on training? And so I would say an anti-corruption training that mainstreams gender, it would have a feminist framework, but it would also consider on a practical level more gender sensitive mechanisms. And so now zooming out, zooming out a little bit, all of this research made me sort of think, where are the gender experts in the UN CSW space who can assist in this training and development of gender and corruption as a field? And so I decided to attend the CSW and gather this information. And after doing a search and participating in this conference for a week, I've noticed that there have only been 3 events on gender and corruption, which are listed here. And so this shows that there's clearly an interest in the field, but there's also a need for more anti-corruption experts, more gender experts to collaborate together, particularly when it comes to gender corruption and climate change, as it's a relatively new field that hasn't been discussed in this conference, though corruption can be a great barrier for women during times of environmental disaster. And so just to wrap everything up, for future outlooks, more feminist, intersectional, interdisciplinary conversations are needed on gender and corruption in the academic literature, in anti-corruption training, gender training, and finally the CSW space. And like I said, I don't really know that much about the connection between gender, climate change, and corruption, but I'm hoping to see that it's like a growing field with more interest. And if you have any more information on that, please let me know, because I'd be interested in learning more. And yeah, that's everything. Thank you so much. I'll hand it over to Katie, I believe.
Thank you. All right. I am going to build a little bit off of Casey's presentation, but also tie in some of the other themes that we've been talking about during our session today. And so my research is on preventing violent extremism through education, specifically in Finland. You may say to yourself, how does this connect to environmental concerns? One of the really interesting things, especially last fall, was that there was a loud voice, a researcher in Sweden, Andres Malm, who published a book about using sabotage as a technique in climate protests. And he was in interviews, he was very careful to talk only about like sabotage and damage to property. But this connects with this idea of climate change and violent extremism, in part because we see growing concerns over climate change and climate change continuing to be a driver of violence broadly and a driver of extremist violence as well. And we don't see that to the same degree in Finland as we do in Eastern Europe, but in Eastern Europe, there's been a rise of sort of eco-fascism. So a combination of climate concerns as well as right-wing ethno-nationalist messaging that combined. And so that is something that will continue to be a problem as we move forward. And so my research really starts in education and looks at the way that education can work as a preventative technique. So I am a PhD student. I was a teacher for 10 years. I taught secondary school history, and I am here in Finland on a grant from the Fulbright Finland Foundation and the Finnish National Agency for Education. And so my current research really focuses on how teachers understand their role in the prevention of violent extremism. And it falls under the broad umbrella of PVEE, and that is prevention of violent extremism through education. And so on the slide here right now, I have a definition of violent extremism. And the definition I use and I employ in my research is one that differentiates between violent actions and extremist ideas. So when we talk about violent extremism, we focus on the violent actions. So we'll talk about violent actions, plans, or actual events where violence has occurred. However, when we focus on prevention, instead of focusing on the action, we look at the extremist ideas. So in Finland, there is a broad-based focus on the prevention of violent extremism. I want to talk a little bit about how we talk about prevention broadly, and then I'll move into what that looks like specifically in Finland. So traditionally, when we think about prevention, we think about military, we think about the police, we think about an emphasis on defense and securitization. And that causes problems, specifically in targeting of specific populations, and the over-targeting of those populations. You know, I often tell this story in my research that I had a friend who I went to college with, and then we moved to California at the same time. And so we lived in the same city at two different places in the US, in Washington, DC, and in San Diego for about 10 years. And we flew approximately the same number of times during those 10 years. And so at one point we were having a conversation and I was sharing, oh, you know, I never got stopped for those random security checks. And this is after 9/11. So from about 2003 to 2013. And he looks at me and his name is Faraz Mohammadi. He is American citizen, but of Iranian or Persian ancestry. And he says, Katie, I am stopped every single time for a random selection. So that just illustrates the way that we traditionally conceptualize prevention in this militarized way is problematic. So my proposition is that instead we use education. And the reason we should be thinking about using education is that education broadly can be considered a driver of conflicts as well as an ameliorator of conflicts. It is also uniquely situated because it is a total institution that already deals with socialization and acculturation and hidden curriculum, and that we are able to encourage tolerance, democratic ideals within educational institutions. And then finally, and one of the arguments nearest and dearest to my heart, is that the feminization of security responses is something that was called for by the UN Security Council in the year 2000 in their 1325 resolution that asks for women to be included in conversations of peace building and conflict. And there are problems with that, and some of them I'll circle back around to when I have my ongoing questions, but the inclusion in the conversation is especially important. And teaching as a gendered profession is a place where that work can happen. So in my research, I'm looking at teachers, how they understand their role, how they use curriculum, and how they use pedagogy. In Finland, and one of the reasons I'm doing my research here is that they include education in their national plan to prevent violent extremism and have included it loosely since 2012 and more specifically since 2019. They include teacher trainings, either broadly or with specific programs like Gutsy Go or ICUC. They also have student programs and student training around these issues. Gutsy Go and ICUC are examples of programs that are for students that teachers are trained to implement. And then this research is ongoing. It's where I'm finishing up on a grant that is funded by the Academy of Finland, and I will be working with a Finnish researcher moving forward to look at this in more detail. And so this is taken from the Finnish National Plan for Preventing Violent Extremism. And so if you see here, 1A and 1B are really where my research focuses. So does all students educators, NGOs, youth workers, parents, student welfare teams who are working on addressing extremism by talking about current events, by preventing polarization, discussing controversial issues, and then unpacking this affective piece of it as well. So in my research, I'm going to summarize just sort of my findings where we are currently, looking at 3 different types of data I've collected. So I'm doing document analysis, I'm looking at interviews with experts, so policymakers, researchers, bureaucrats, and then interviews with teachers as well. And so if you look at the content analysis here from the documents, I searched for keywords. And so you see in English, I have 58 documents that I'm looking at. In Finnish, I have 25. My Finnish is very beginner, so I have colleagues who are assisting me with this. But you'll see education is mentioned many times, curriculum as well, teachers. However, pedagogy is not mentioned. And pedagogy, for those of you who are not in the educational research space, is how we teach things, how we construct lessons. And I'll go into that a little bit more when I share how teachers have talked about how they use pedagogy in their classrooms. So Finnish experts talked to me about the conceptualization of Finland as a peaceful or violent place. So one of the most interesting things that came out of this was this idea that the historic role of Lutheranism in Finland is a version of the modern social democracy. So that social democracy is secular Lutheranism, that there's high levels of trust in government, there's strong social ties, and you'll notice that Finland just was named the happiest place on earth as well. And the Finns always laugh about that. But this trust and authority in government is a part of that. Another key thing is that violence is private in Finland. So if I'm walking around the street, I don't worry about experiencing violence. The violence that does show up in Finland in forms of direct violence is often within families, within intimate relationships, and between friends. So in Finland, there are concerns in terms of violent extremism with many different types of extremist violence, with jihadism, with far-right extremism, and we really have seen that shift in the past 10 years, where in 2012, the concern was perhaps more with jihadism and other religious extremisms, and now in 2022, we see more concern with far-right extremism. Funding comes from many different departments, and there is a need in Finland for this work to be done because as more and more people migrate to Finland, because of their declining birth rate, the population becomes less homogeneous. So as I mentioned before, the training here is broadly based. And it really focuses on increasing resilience, relationship skills, group dynamics, and media literacy. And one of the really interesting things to come out of my research was that there's a tension that exists between bureaucrats and teachers as policy actors. So we're seeing bureaucrats, when I talk to these experts, I ask them, is education the right space to be doing this? And they say, oh yes, no, education definitely is the right space for this work to be happening. Even when I talk to security and police specialists, they say, yes, education is the space for this to be happening. However, when I ask teachers, the response is different. And they say, yes, maybe not. So it really varies. And some of this right is about who holds the power. And we ask education in our society to do so much work. And especially coming off of COVID, we've been asking them for the past 2 years to do even more work than we already were doing. So in talking to teachers, there is a clear consensus that certain groups are considered more at risk for engaging in violent extremism. male students and students who are isolated, or as one teacher termed it, misfits. However, it's less clear whether secondary students or vocational education students were at more risk, whether Finnish students or immigrant students were at more risk, or whether class played a role. So for all of these less clear categories, I had teachers on either side of the answer, and it was pretty evenly split. So a summary of my broad findings here are that almost all teachers had witnessed ideological extremism in students. It was mostly minor, but when I asked them originally, have you ever seen this? They would say, no, no, no. And then about halfway through the interview, they'd say, actually, I think I do have an example. And so they come back and they tell me a story, and it would be small, right? There weren't violent acts happening in most stories, but there were embracing of ideas and beliefs, perhaps, that showed up in extremist ideologies. Teachers talked about using curriculum, using texts, books, videos to help drive conversations. They talked about tools pedagogically, so an emphasis on dialogue, on practicing perspective taking through simulations where you represent one group's ideas, and then being student-centered and responsive to student needs. They talked about social and emotional, demonstrating social and emotional skills, helping students practice dealing with moderation, identifying emotions, and then responding to those emotions appropriately. They talked about how the observational presence of teachers is important and how class size makes a difference. In a class of 11, it was very easy to identify these problems. In a class of 36 or 40 or 50, it gets even harder. And then one of the really interesting pieces that came out of my research was that special education teachers were highly represented in my sample. Not intentionally, but it seems like there's a connection between teachers of special education and those who are concerned with violent extremism. So the questions that still linger for me, and 2 or 3 that I think are really important for our conversation here at CSW is, what is the role of gender in this? And part of the reason I ask that is because there are ongoing conversations in the community of researchers who look at violent extremism about whether, because violent norms for men are different from norms around violence for women, whether that makes men's and male students' extremist violence more visible to the world, and whether there are young women and girls who are engaged with extremist ideas and ideologies, but because norms around violent acts are different for women, that they don't engage in those spaces. So should we be addressing those concerns differently to make sure we're reaching young women as well? The second piece here that's really interesting is this question of power. And I had a teacher say to me recently that they think the desire to engage in extremist acts and ideologies is based on power. And I thought that was really smart and really insightful. And that if students want power, I think we all want power. We want power over our individual bodies and lives. And so how do we navigate embracing and encouraging students to embrace their own power over themselves without encouraging them to gain manipulative power over others? So I have lots of things to talk about. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them. I believe I am the last speaker today, and we have some time left. And so I am going to stop sharing and hand the microphone back to Margaret, who will facilitate our question and answers.
Thank you so much, Kathlyn. And thank you so much to all of our presenters. All the presentations were excellent. And like Kathlyn said, we can open it now up for any questions that anybody has.